Good evening, I'm Anne Howard. I'm a member of the Scottish Laity Network, and tonight it's my privilege to welcome you to the third session of our Towards Pentecost 2022. Listening and responding to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. And tonight we ask the question, is a circular economy the way forward? And our companion for the evening is Kim Pratt. But as we gather this evening, our thoughts and prayers are still very much with the people of Ukraine. And so we begin in prayer for them. And as we pray for the people of Ukraine, let us also remember the people of Syria, Yemen, Palestine, Iraq, and all those who are suffering from war and violence. And we also remember today one of our own members, John Norman, who died very suddenly. May John now experience the fullness of the love and mercy of God.
Lord, hear my prayer. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. When I call, answer me. Lord, hear my prayer. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. Come and listen to me. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. When I call, answer me. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. Come and listen to me. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. When I call, answer me. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. Oh Lord, hear my prayer. Come and listen.
And in the context of the war in Ukraine and all wars and those acts of violence which don't get reported in the mainstream media, we remember the words of Pope Paul VI, proclaimed 50 years ago, "If you want peace, work for justice." But sadly, 50 years on, our world is even more in need of justice. The cry of the poor and the cry of the earth gets louder and louder. And in seeking to respond, Pope Francis has repeatedly said that our current economic models are not a solution. Rather, they are part of the problem. And so in January this year, the Vatican COVID-19 Commission hosted a conference, Prepare the Future, Building a Regenerative, Inclusive and Sustainable Economy. And Pope Francis sent a message to the Commission which said,
"The world of economics and finance has an important responsibility in promoting a paradigm shift and helping find creative solutions. May your measures of success not be profits, expansion, and shortest term returns. Instead, may the measure be the number of people who move out of extreme poverty, who can work decently, Is it so difficult to assure the conditions whereby everyone can contribute to transforming the world with their work?
Last week, Laurie Morgan Klein brought home the stark reality of our current economic model as he shared stories of various tipping points which can lead to debt, poverty, and despair. So tonight we focus on, is a circular economy a way forward? And we are delighted that Echo Congregation Scotland are co-badging this session. I welcome Stephen Curran, who will say a few words about them, and then welcome and introduce our companion for the evening, Stephen.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to join the Scottish Laity Network on our journey towards Pentecost this year. I'm Stephen Curran, I'm a parishioner at St Helens Catholic Church in Langside in the south of Glasgow and manager of Echo Congregation Scotland, which is a charity supporting local parishes throughout the country in environmental activities towards a much greener net zero Scotland. We support at the moment 586 parishes throughout the country in environmental activities to care and act for God's creation. And I'm delighted to introduce our fantastic companion on the journey tonight, Kim Pratt. Originally from London and now in Scotland. Thanks to joining us tonight, Kim. Kim studied environmental management and protection, and her work focused on material and waste research in a policy context and included developing the Scottish carbon metric. That's a national indicator for measuring the carbon impacts of waste. And she's a guest lecturer at Edinburgh and Strathclyde Universities on life cycle analysis, which is a technique used to measure and compare environmental impacts of products and systems. The important thing for us tonight is that Kimberly Pratt is a leading expert on the circular economy in Scotland. And I'm delighted that her work as the circular economy campaigner with Friends of the Earth Scotland has really pushed to the fore this important topic, which we can all be part of, and looking at the next topic is a circular economy, a way forward. Thank you, Kim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and Anne as well for that lovely introduction. I'm going to try and share my screen first of all. Let's see. Okay. So is someone able to just let me know if that has come through on the main screen? Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I will make a start. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you tonight. I'm going to be talking about the problem of overconsumption and climate change. So firstly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and about the organisation that I work for. I work for Friends of the Earth Scotland. We are Scotland's leading environmental campaigning organisation. We work with a network of thousands of supporters across Scotland, and we are part of the world's largest grassroots environmental network, uniting over 2 million supporters from 73 nations. So not quite as many as the Catholic faith, but you know, I'm sure there's some crossover there. Our vision is of a world where everyone can enjoy a healthy environment and a fair share of the Earth's resources. And we campaign for a just transition to a sustainable society. A little bit about me. I'll just go through this quickly. I didn't realize I'd be getting such a thorough introduction from Stephen. So most of this has been covered. I'm the circular economy campaigner for Friends of the Earth Scotland. And if the phrase circular economy is one that you're not very familiar with, don't worry, it's something that I'll be covering tonight. And as mentioned, I also lecture at Edinburgh and Strathclyde University. And I've also worked for an organisation called Zero Waste Scotland, who are funded by the Scottish Government and support them to improve recycling and reduce material consumption in Scotland. So in my day-to-day job, I campaign for a better use of resources and changes to the way that we manage waste in Scotland. And I work with policymakers, NGOs, trade unions, and others to do this. And I also do research into a fairer, more sustainable planet. So what I would like to talk to you tonight about is about overconsumption and climate change. And I've split my talk up into 3 different sections. So I'm going to start by talking about the problem and what I mean by overconsumption, and then how that leads to climate change. And then I'm going to talk about why that matters. And thirdly, I'll finish up with what should we be doing instead. So consumption of materials is the main driver of many different environmental crises, and I'll just talk through a few of those. So, for example, deforestation is leading to extinction level losses of biodiversity around the world, and there's now more plastic litter in our oceans than there is fish by weight. And things like mining are very environmentally destructive, where they leach chemicals into the environment and cause more biodiversity loss. And throughout all these different types of consumption of materials and extraction of materials through our environment and the environmental impact that has, there's this problem of climate change and the climate crisis, which is the most immediate threat to our existence from an environmental point of view. So when we're cutting down trees, we're stopping CO2 being absorbed and from the atmosphere. Plastic is made from fossil fuels, and extracting materials to make products adds greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So even if you're doing something like using a computer, you're still using materials and using electricity. Everything we do, everything we buy comes back to materials. So the way that we use them and how much we consume is a really important way of understanding how we're interacting with our environment and how we can reduce our environmental impacts. So this graph here shows global material use over time. So the red line shows a sustainable threshold for the amount of material use that as a world we can use and it's still sustainable, and we are not taking more than is our fair share. As you can see, we crossed this line in about the year 2000, and we're now at very unsustainable levels of material use. And of course, this is not evenly spread throughout the different nations of the world. If you look at low-income nations, they're using much less materials than the high-income nations. And again, this red line shows a sustainable level of material use. And in fact, scientists have estimated that we could all live a high quality lifestyle and a sustainable lifestyle with about 8 tons of material used per year per person. So that's what this red line here shows. And people from low income nations are well below this line, and their quality of life is affected by that. And in fact, a lot of the materials that are being extracted are coming from low income nations and being exported to richer nations to feed our consumption. And it is in the highest income nations that we see the most consumption and the most damage. And in fact, Scotland sits within this very highest bracket, and our material use in Scotland is over double the sustainable limit. So I'm just going to focus on Scotland a little bit with this. So this graph here shows you the material use in Scotland. Thinking about it out on a per person basis. So sometimes we call this a material footprint. It's a very similar idea to a carbon footprint. So your material footprint is the average amount of material consumption for one person in a country for 1 year. So that includes all the food that you eat for that year, all the products that you buy, like electronics and clothes and things. But it also includes your share of roads and buildings and any construction that's happening in your country that year. And it also includes all the raw materials that went in to making the products that you buy. And I'll come back to that idea later on, because that's an important one. So in Scotland, our material footprint is about 18 tonnes per person per year. And that is higher than the UK average and also the EU average as well. Before I move on, I just want to pause here and make an important point. When we use the term material footprint or carbon footprint, it can be a really useful way of talking about how much we're consuming or how much we're emitting as a nation, because it makes everything very relatable to an individual. But it almost puts too much emphasis on the individual to change, and blame as well. And that's not the intention, at least when I use it. When it was, in fact, the term carbon footprint was originally created by BP, and the term was actually created in order to ensure blame was moved onto their customers rather than onto the company themselves. So when we say the term carbon footprint, that has some connotations with it that are not intentional sometimes. Friends of the Earth Scotland is not blaming individuals for our carbon or our material footprint. It's the system that needs to change, and governments and producers and retailers bear the most responsibility for that change. So these terms are useful when we're thinking about carbon and material use and relating it to people, but that doesn't mean it's the individual that is to blame. So why are we consuming so much materials? The answer comes back to our growing economy. So this graph here shows GDP, global GDP and material footprint, and you can see that they're both going up together. They're both linked. And in fact, this graph shows us that between 1990 and 2010, our GDP and our material footprint both nearly doubled. And there is this very strong relationship between GDP or economic growth and materials, because we need those materials to keep growing our economy. The more materials that we buy, the more our economy grows, but also the more greenhouse gases are emitted as well. So all three are linked and all three are going up together. And the reason why materials are so closely linked to our emissions and why that relationship exists comes back to products and the carbon emissions associated with them. So this little graph here, or this diagram, shows you the common life cycle of products. So if you think of a product like a mobile phone or a glass of orange juice, those products will have a life cycle where they go from extraction of the raw materials, and then production, where you make those raw materials into the product, distribution and consumption by the consumer, and then disposal. This is a kind of life cycle that we see commonly throughout most products. And in fact, what we find when we look at the carbon emissions associated with these products is that it's this first stage, the material extraction stage, that's the most carbon intensive usually. And when you think about that stage, if you think about drilling for oil or agriculture or mining, these are very resource intensive and energy intensive things to do. So it makes sense that this extraction stage has the biggest impact associated with it. That also points a little bit towards the potential solution as well, because it means that we know if we can focus on reducing that extraction and trying to take less from nature in the first place, then that is the way that we can maximize our environmental savings and reduce our environmental impact as much as possible. So when we look at Scotland's carbon footprint, we find that 82% of the impact on our emissions come from the things that we buy. And that 52% of that, so more than half of that, comes from products that are imports. And if you have a look around your home now and consider some of the products that you can see, there'll be some things there that might have been made in the UK, and there might be other products that have come from further afield. And I'm sure everyone, if they look around them right now, will be able to see products that come from outside of the UK. This is evidence of our globalized society, and it's also evidence of the power of the Scottish consumer to have an impact and to change our emissions in Scotland. So about 52% of our products are coming from imports. However, Scotland's climate targets only cover our domestic emissions. So I've got a little diagram to try and show this. So our emissions from products make up 82% of our carbon footprint, but more than half of these are imported products. And it's only our domestic emissions that count towards our climate targets. So at the moment, we're not measuring a big part of our carbon impact. So before I go on to the next section, I'm just going to summarize what I've been through here. So material consumption is unsustainably high, and it's driving multiple environmental crises. Rich countries like Scotland have a disproportionately high material footprint. And its material footprint and the economy and climate change are all linked together. The more we buy, the more GDP grows and the more greenhouse gases are emitted. It's that first stage of the product life cycle, the material extraction, that's usually the most carbon intensive stage of a product's life cycle. And 82% of Scotland's carbon footprint comes from the things we buy. But most of those things are coming from outside of Scotland and don't count towards our climate targets. So I'm going to move on to why this matters. So Scotland does have a plan to reduce climate change and reduce our emissions. And our aim is to become net zero by 2045. And we need to completely transform our energy and our transport systems in order to be able to do this. It's a massive undertaking. And we know at the heart of this solution will be electric vehicles and renewable power that can reduce Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. And there's no doubt that electric cars and wind turbines and solar panels reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. However, in order to succeed in this plan, we are going to rely on a lot of material consumption. And like everything else we consume, most of that is going to come from abroad, from overseas. And this is an example here of the amount of material consumption needed for this transformation. So what this graph shows us is the material requirements to make a certain amount of electricity from wind turbines and solar panels and fossil fuel options as well. So you can see the amount of materials that we need to make these renewable technologies is much higher than what we need to make fossil fuel based power generation. And just to be really clear, I'm not saying that wind turbines have a greater overall environmental impact. They're an essential part of reducing Scotland's climate impact. But at the moment, we're not thinking about the material impact of this transition. That's also true when we think about cars as well. So an electric car requires a lot more materials than a conventional car. And that's because it's a more complicated thing. The batteries and things have a lot more requirement for different types of materials. And if we don't address our global consumption impacts, if we continue to focus on just the carbon emissions associated with Scotland, then we might miss this bigger picture and understanding that there's another environmental crisis out there that we should be paying attention to. So I'm not going to go into detail in this slide, but I think it's a nice illustration that shows us that along the top here are lots of different types of low carbon technologies, and these are all different types of materials, and you can see that that there are lots of different materials that are required for these different types of technologies. And if we are going to create a low carbon economy, we are going to need a large supply of different materials, and some of these are very rare. There's also a nice piece of work looking at whether the UK is using its fair share of these materials. So a lot of these materials are quite rare. You have to mine through a lot of material in order to extract a single ton of something like lithium. There's not very much of it in the world, and the UK carbons policies means that we will be demanding a lot of these materials. And in fact, if we are to meet our climate targets, we're going to be demanding more than our fair share of these materials. So I just really kind of put this slide in to kind of illustrate that we're really only thinking about our domestic emissions. So this picture here comes from the cover of a report from the Climate Change Committee, which is a group of scientists that advises the UK and Scottish government on their climate policies. And as you can see just from this illustration, it's got a picture of the UK in the middle in a box and all the solutions around it. And it's really not thinking beyond our borders at all. And I think it's a nice illustration of the fact that we're doing a lot of work to reduce our domestic emissions, but we're not thinking outside that box at the moment. Having said that, in their most recent communication, the Climate Change Committee, who wrote this report, have acknowledged that we need to start addressing overseas consumption's emissions as well. We can and should be addressing it, it says. So going back to these minerals that we're going to need for our energy transition, this graph here shows that our minerals that we will need for this transition are coming from a variety of different countries. And some of these countries have quite poor human rights records, and there are questions about security supply as well. In terms of the carbon emissions of the products that the minerals that we are talking about here, they're very carbon intensive to produce. So iron and steel, which is another really important material for our economy, is often thought of as very carbon intensive to produce. But what this graph here shows us is that ton for ton, some of these other minerals that we need are even more carbon intensive to extract. And that's because they're very rare. So it's difficult to mine them. As well as the environmental cost, there's a social cost as well. These minerals are extracted in countries with, as I said, poor human rights records. And there are risks that go along with that. And I'm going to read these risks out in full, because I think it's really important to be aware of these things. So mining for these materials can mean forced displacement of indigenous and local communities, the use of violence against communities, poor and illegal labour conditions, including forced labour, child labour, human trafficking, sexual exploitation, unsanitary conditions, safety violations leading to injury, illness and death. There's also a high risk of flooding, poor air quality and contaminated groundwater for those who live close to these mines, and long-term damage to food and irrigation as well. So we have to remember, alongside this environmental crisis that we're creating, there is also a social crisis that goes alongside that as well. So just to summarize this section, our demand for imported goods still has an environmental and social impact, even if we're not measuring it. And if we don't address our global consumption impact, then we risk replacing one environmental crisis with another. Our climate policies require huge amounts of minerals, which are currently sourced in unjust and unsustainable ways. So I'm going to move on to talk about what we should be doing instead. And I thought I'd start with what Pope Francis has said on the issue. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. This is from his encyclical on climate change. And I just pulled out a couple of quotes that I thought were really relevant, especially this middle one. Reducing greenhouse gases requires honesty, courage and responsibility, above all on the parts of those countries which are more powerful and pollute the most. So I think Pope Francis has given us a really good indication and steer for where we need to be going on this issue. There is also a lot of excellent thinking being done in the realm of economics on this. So you may have come across this idea of donut economics. This is the idea that combining the idea of we have planetary boundaries that we should not be exceeding, and we have socially acceptable boundaries that we should be meeting for everybody. So everybody has the right to housing, to gender equality, to a certain amount of food and energy and a healthy living and education. These are the social foundations that everybody has a human right to, and the minimum that we should be achieving for everybody. But then we also have these ecological ceilings of where we shouldn't be going too far, because we will end up causing climate change or ocean acidification, for example. And it's in this kind of middle boundary, this donut, where there is a safe and just place for humanity. And that is very much shaping the thinking on these issues about where we need to be going in terms of living more sustainably. In terms of our material use, there is a solution as well. So at the moment, we are all trapped in what is often called a linear economy. So that's going back to that idea of a linear life cycle of products and taking from the environment, making it into something that is often only used once or for a few seconds or minutes, and then thrown away and never used again. That's our linear economy that we are all part of at the moment. And what we could be aiming for is a circular economy where we value our materials properly. And when we take something from nature, we make sure that we reuse it and we recycle it as much as possible. And we have to recycle it and cycle it around the loop as many times as possible, but also as slowly as possible. And that means that we don't take from nature so much. This is another diagram that's often used to talk about a circular economy. So it's split materials up into bio-based materials and the bioeconomy, things like food, and then inert materials. And I think the main thing to take from this is it's all about kind of cycling back through the loops and using things as many times as possible. There are some countries that have started to make some excellent progress on this issue. The Netherlands is leading the way, and they have a target already to become completely circular by 2050, which means there'll be no waste in their society. That's what they're aiming for. Sweden has become the first country to commit to introducing consumption-based targets, so including those emissions that aren't just from their domestic production, but looking at taking responsibility for their wider global impact. And the EU Parliament voted last year for science-based binding material targets. So there's some really encouraging first steps being seen here. And in terms of what we can be doing in Scotland, I want to talk about 3 examples with you of things that are changing. There's a lot happening in Scotland as well. So you might have heard of this idea of deposit return schemes. Scotland is planning on introducing one next year. This is the idea of when you buy a bottle of a drink, or a plastic bottle or a glass bottle or a metal can, when you pay for it, you pay a small deposit, 20p, and then when you're finished with your drink, you bring it back to the shop and you get your 20p back. And these schemes are really exciting because they massively increase recycling rates. Recycling rates for these materials at the moment are about 40%. With a deposit return scheme, countries are seeing recycling rates shoot up to 90% for these materials. And it's incredibly high quality recycling, which it matters a lot because it means you can recycle it more and more times. So these schemes are really exciting, and Scotland should be getting a deposit return scheme for bottles next year. This is an example as well of an idea that producers should be taking more responsibility for the disposal of their products. So the aim here is to get the producer to take responsibility for the scheme and to take responsibility for their products more as well. And that idea is not being used just for deposit returns, but being applied to things like mattresses and batteries and electronics. And it's a way of really bringing the cost back to the producers, those who can do most about it. Another example of a material that's important to the Scottish economy is steel. So in Scotland, we create about 1 million tonnes of scrap steel that's exported for recycling every year. We don't have any facilities in Scotland to process scrap steel ourselves. And this is, we're going to have larger and larger amounts of scrap steel being produced because of oil and gas decommissioning. And in fact, even more as the first generation of wind turbines starts to be decommissioned as well. All of this contains really high quality steel that is an excellent material for recycling. At the same time as Scotland is producing all this scrap metal, we have a huge demand for steel as well. So this picture here shows you wind turbine foundations, which are made of steel, arriving in Inverness from Saudi Arabia. So these steel foundations have been made with recycled steel, in Saudi Arabia and then transported all the way back to Scotland. Whereas at the same time, we're exporting steel. It just feels like crazy, really. Instead, what we could be doing is recycling our own steel in Scotland. And that would involve building what's called an electric arc furnace. So this is a very modern, very efficient way of reprocessing steel. And this would save about 60% of carbon emissions involved in producing steel compared to what we're currently doing. So I think this is a really nice example of how we could be creating a circular economy in Scotland, and one that has other benefits as well, because as well as those carbon savings and the material savings, we're also creating a lot of new jobs as well. And this is in an area where there's a big concern about jobs as oil and gas decommissioning takes hold. To be able to create other jobs in that area, green skilled jobs is a really important opportunity as well. And then my third example is to do with incineration of waste. So when we incinerate waste, we lock ourselves into a circular economy. It sounds obvious, but if you burn something, then you can't recycle it. We've had a 700% increase in incineration of household waste in Scotland over the last decade. And that is mainly to do with the landfill tax, making it more expensive for councils to landfill our waste. And instead of turning to recycling opportunities, councils who are incredibly stretched and have incredibly tight budgets have gone for the next cheapest option, which is to incinerate waste. And now a lot of our councils across Scotland are tied up into long-term contracts with incinerators. And that's why we've seen this massive rise in incineration. As well as locking us into a circular economy, when we burn waste materials like plastics, which are made of fossil fuels, they emit greenhouse gases to the atmosphere as well. So they're contributing to climate change directly. This week, there was an independent review which was commissioned by the Scottish government that was published, and it recommended that Scotland ban the building of any new incinerators in Scotland, and also that we should be trying to reduce the impact of our existing plants, and that could involve recycling more and stopping burning plastic. So there's a lot happening in terms of trying to create that system change that we need in order to move from a linear economy to a circular economy. And in fact, this month, later on this month, we expect the Scottish Government to publish a consultation on a circular economy bill. So this will be their main way of creating the change that we need to see in Scotland to reduce our material consumption. As part of our response to this consultation, Friends of the Earth Scotland is going to be asking for targets to reduce our carbon footprint. So making sure we take responsibility, not just for the emissions within Scotland, but looking wider as well. And we also want to see targets to reduce our material footprint as well, and working with different sectors who have different material needs. We want to see a ban on new incinerators, so making sure that the Scottish Government act on the recommendations from their own independent review. And we also want to see a strategy for steel, a more circular economy thinking, which is done in consultation with key stakeholders like trade unions, and which looks at removing barriers such as the cost of electricity. Individuals can help as well, as saying earlier on that this is not the fault of the individual, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a role. So you can respond to the Circular Economy Bill when it comes out, and Friends of the Earth Scotland will be supporting people to do that. So please keep in touch if that's something that you're interested in. Starting next week, there's is the Big Plastic Count. So this is something that's been organised by Greenpeace, actually. And I put a link in here, but actually, if you just Google Big Plastic Count, you'll find it. And this is an idea from a campaigner who decided to start collecting all the plastic packaging in his life. He collected all his packaging for a year and then sorted it out and tried to work out what could have been recycled and what wasn't going to be recycled, and learned a lot about the way he was living and what he could do to change his impact on the world. And he then took this idea and has created it into this campaign called the Big Plastic Count, where for 1 week, households are being asked to collect their plastic packaging and count it, and then send their results into Greenpeace. And Greenpeace are going to do a lot of analysis to see what people are recycling, what materials aren't possible to recycle yet, and are going to create some demands for how we should be changing the plastic and the way that we use plastic across the UK. So if that sounds like it could be of interest to you, then please do sign up for that. When the government start to consult on their incineration work as well, then it will be possible for individuals to respond to that as well. That's a little bit further out in the future. And then, of course, it's really useful, always useful, to write to your politicians about your concerns. And if you feel like it, you could join Friends of the Earth Scotland as well, or another local environmental group who are doing fantastic work throughout the whole of Scotland and the rest of the UK to try and fight these problems. And just to summarise my talk, so material consumption is driving many different environmental crises, and it's the high-income nations that are responsible for most material consumptions, places like Scotland. 82% of our carbon footprint in Scotland comes from the things that we buy, and most of this comes from our imports, which Scotland's climate targets don't cover. Unless we measure our global impact, then we risk replacing one environmental and social crisis with another. And the solution is to create a circular economy where we value material properly and we change the way we use them. To do this, we need strong leadership from our government and swift action from producers. And Friends of the Earth Scotland is calling for strong consumption targets in the Circular Economy Bill. Thank you very much for listening. That's the end of my talk.
Kim, thank you very much. A lot to consider there and a lot to ponder, but there's already some questions coming into the chat, so let's just get stuck straight in. And while we start the conversation, folks, please do continue to share your questions, your thoughts, your reflections inside the chat area there. So the first question that I'm going to turn to Kim asks, how would mining our waste, especially electronic waste, make a difference, if it would?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think that there's a lot of interesting research happening. And actually, some countries are already starting to mine their landfills. And I think this makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of really good material in there. I think in a mobile phone, there's like hundreds of a gram of gold or something, and that's equivalent to 1 kilometer of seawater or something. So like the concentrations of materials in landfills for some of these really important critical materials to our economy are actually quite high, and I'm sure we will actually see us mining our landfills in the near future, because they will be one of the best sources of some of these materials. So yeah, I think that's a really good point, and something that we're going to be seeing more of in the future.
Sticking with that theme then of waste, and then also thinking maybe moving into this idea of recycling, John asks, batteries are recycled, but how effective is that?
So it's not something I know a lot about, in terms of how the actual process itself, what I would say is, I know that batteries are made from very carbon intensive critical materials. So the less of those materials that we take from the environment, the better. So, and we've got to get better at recycling our batteries. And I don't just mean household batteries, I mean things like batteries from cars, and particularly electric cars, and things like the batteries used in wind turbines as well. At the moment, those products contain materials that are not possible to recycle. We don't have the technology to do that yet. So that is something that we really urgently need to address, because there is a huge amount of those materials now locked up in the products that we use in our cars, in our wind turbines, but they are going to be coming to the end of their life soon. And we need to have the recycling technology in place so that we can extract those materials when they do come to the end of their life. So hopefully that's useful.
Thanks, Kim. And then thinking in a more general sense about how your work and the message that you share is perceived, the next question asks, do you see a disparity perhaps between different age groups or different demographics in terms of how the message around the urgency of the climate crisis is perceived?
Yeah, that's another really good question, and something that I think we do see as a society now more and more. So I attended COP26 last year, some events there, and also went on the climate march as well. And I think what I found with that is that there were different people involved in the actual meetings, to those who were on the climate march and calling for change. And I think a lot of younger people, or not just younger people, people across society do understand the urgency, and that is not being met by politicians. And I think that is in the name of trying to balance the needs of people against other types of stakeholders, like these big corporations and things. But ultimately, our political leaders serve the people, or they should serve the people. And it's our job to remind them of that, I think.
And then thinking a bit further then about the perception of the message, do you feel that politicians, leaders are listening to the experts, or do you feel like there's a kind of lack of willingness to engage with the issue?
Yes, well, that is a really interesting one, especially in Scotland at the moment, because we have our first Green ministers in government. And if anyone is going to listen to this issue, surely it is people from the Scottish Green Party. We actually have a circular economy minister in Scotland, the first circular economy minister in the world, Lorna Slater. And she has a technical background. She's an engineer. And so you would think that she would be able to have a good grasp of the issues, and I'm sure she does understand the issues, but there's still a gap, I think, even with someone who has a technical background, is in the same political space, and then in terms of action, there's just not much happening yet. I think there's a hesitancy there still, and it's difficult to say why that is really. It's just something that we have to keep on pushing on, I think.
That's interesting. And then if I was to take that idea, because I know we've spoken quite extensively there about the Scottish political context, and broaden that a bit more, look at perhaps overseas. Rab asks, did the Netherlands manage to get the business sector on board with their proposal for a circular economy?
Yes, so they did. And so the Netherlands worked in consultation with 400 different stakeholders across the company. So different companies involved in different sectors. They split their plan up into 5 different sectors, so things like food and plastics, construction, and then they worked on each of those individual sectors and worked with not just companies but other types of stakeholders as well, so academics and NGOs as well, to create resource plans for each of those 5 different areas. And each of those resource plans then had to add up to the overall target. So everybody was contributing to it, and everybody had a role and had been involved in the process to create that target and create that plan. And I think that that is a really interesting model that we could be applying to Scotland as well, as a way to create buy-in and create a plan that everyone is involved with and everyone can work towards to the future.
And then again, perhaps looking at something slightly different this time, Gemma's asking about the fishing industry and whether Friends of the Earth challenge the fishing industry, you know, thinking about, I think this probably rose to prominence through the Seaspiracy documentary that many of us will have seen, seemingly the biggest polluter of our seas. Is that an area that Friends of the Earth has been active in Scotland?
I don't think we have been active on that, to be honest. Friends of the Earth Scotland is part of a wider environmental NGO group, so charities, many of whom focus on the marine environment. So I work closely with the Marine Conservation Society on marine issues. So they, I know that they work with the fishing industry on that particular issue, and if anyone's interested in that, then please do get in touch, and you know, I can pass on some details of people who would be able to answer those questions for you. But yes, in general, in terms of fishing and on marine environment, a lot of our work focuses on trying to reduce the amount of litter that is going into our oceans. So we do, some of our local groups, there's a local group in Falkirk who do a lot of beach cleanups. And one of the things they're really interested in is these tiny little plastic pellets called nurdles. I don't know if that's something that people here are familiar with, but these little plastic pellets are what new plastic is transported as across the world, and a lot of it ends up in Grangemouth near Falkirk. So you see a lot of this type of plastic pollution around the Firth of Forth, because we've got a lot of plastic production happening there. I think Ineos in Grangemouth is the 3rd biggest producer of plastic in Europe.
As I look out my window just now, I can see Ineos just over there. So, and I'm aware of the work that has been done, you know, the nurdle hunts down in Bo'ness as well, which is where I'm sitting just now. So fascinating work that's being done around that, definitely. I want to turn now to a question around some of the calculations and some of the statistics that are often referenced in this discussion. And Rosalind asks, am I right that much of the calculations don't include military and arms manufacturing involvement, and in fact that adds a lot to the environmental damage? Is that something that you could comment on?
So I would have to go back and check that. I don't know whether that is specifically in Scotland's calculations for their net zero carbon footprint, What it will be included in is the way that we calculate our carbon footprint. I could get really technical and geeky on this one, but I'll restrain myself. But the way that we calculate carbon footprints across the world takes a kind of top-down approach. So you look at your whole economy and then you split up the economy into different sections. So that gives you a really good indication of your overall impact, because you're capturing everything and then splitting it up rather than building it up from the bottom and saying each sector, measuring each sector, and therefore probably missing some parts of that. By taking that kind of top-down approach, then you maybe it can be more complicated to disentangle things, but you get a good indication of the overall scale of your impact. And that is how carbon footprints are calculated in the UK and across the world now as well. So that will include military impacts. And yeah, I've never really looked into this in any amount of detail, but I can imagine that it would be some pretty major impacts in terms of material use, but also just in terms of waste as well. It's not their primary concern maybe to recycle things as they go along. But if we are going to create a circular economy, every sector has a role to play. So that will have to change as well, I'm sure.
And when we look at addressing some of these issues around the climate crisis, very often the emphasis is put onto the individual. You mentioned yourself around buying electric cars. We've heard about boiler schemes, and often these are very expensive things for the individual to do as well. And the questioner asks, how much of this is pressure in favour of commercial interest in the companies to profit financially and immediately, rather than focusing on the bigger issues and actually addressing and tackling the wider problem?
Yeah, this is the real key point, isn't it? We've got to make it easier for people to do these things. And at the moment, in the news, we've all seen these headlines about the massive profits that are being made from companies like BP and Shell. And, it's quite clear that they don't care about anything apart from the bottom line, really. And that's not good enough anymore. It was never good enough, but it's got to change. We're now at a point where, as a society, we have to choose. That we have this economic model that involves perpetual growth, and we need to kind of get off the train and do something else. And I do really believe that the circular economy is part of that. I listened to a really interesting podcast last night from Jason Hicknell, who some of the graphs that I showed at the beginning about material consumption going up and the links between GDP and material consumption, they came from his work. And I'll share a link to the podcast afterwards. So if you're interested in it, it talks a lot about how we need to change from this model of economic growth to one of degrowth, and changing the whole way that we structure our society. So instead of everybody being as productive as possible and making as much money as possible, we need to change that round and find a new balance for our lives. So it's not just about work. So we have time for other things that are important in our lives as well. And he explains it really well, much better than I can. And I think that's where we need to be aiming for. But it's good that we know where we need to be, but getting there is so hard when we're trapped in this model at the moment of growth. And I think ultimately, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think that it's these changes like a circular economy, trying as hard as possible to use less materials as a society, to change the system in the ways that we can. If we all pull together on this, and then that's the only way that we can really make progress towards the future that is fairer for everybody. Yes, that's just my thoughts on that, really. But yeah, I will share that podcast because I think it's really interesting, and I've really, I'd like to hear what everybody else thinks about that as well.
Thanks, Kim. And I know that if you're able to share that with Rab, I know we'll get that out across the network with the emails for those who've registered for tonight's session. And I'm sure we'll all get a chance to kind of listen to that and digest it. And I'm sure there'll be a few thoughts kicking around afterwards as well. Turning perhaps to Maria's question here, thinking about better local recycling facilities in areas, the role that local authorities have in terms of maybe the need for a unified approach to recycling, things like that. Do you think that would make a difference?
Yes, definitely. So it's really interesting to contrast what is happening in Scotland, where we have different local authorities, different approaches to recycling, to what's happening in Wales, where they have a unified approach to recycling, and they have the third highest recycling rates in the world. They also have a ban on incineration as well, interestingly. And yeah, so Wales are on track to meet their 70% recycling rate in a few years' time. Scotland has the same target, a 70% recycling rate by 2025, but there is no way that we're going to meet that. We're stuck at 42% recycling, and we're actually going down, which is terrible. We've not made any progress really in the last 10 years. Local authorities are a big part of this puzzle, and yeah, they do a lot, but there could be a more unified approach. I definitely agree on that. We could have a system that everybody understood across the whole of Scotland, which would make it much easier for people to recycle. And then also there are gains of local authorities working together. So a really interesting example is a facility called Yes Recycling in Fife, which has started recycling hard to recycle plastics. So things like hard hats and kind of soft, flexible plastics as well. And it's the first facility like that in Scotland. They have a contract with Fife Council, which is great, but we don't need 32 different facilities for recycling soft plastic across Scotland for each of our local authorities. People could be working together to make sure that we don't have too many of these facilities and we end up locking ourselves into producing lots of plastic so that we can recycle it. We've got to think about the future where we want less plastic to begin with and to recycle the stuff that we do have left that we can't do anything about.
And then I'm wondering if I can take it in a slightly different direction again, Kim, and ask, some people are suggesting that the momentum for discussing the climate crisis and environmental issues wanes in the face of international disasters and atrocities such as what we're seeing in Ukraine. Do you feel that that's the case? Do you think that the UK, Scotland and the world has sidelined climate and environmental issues this year? Do you think it's went onto the back burner? And if it has, how can we address that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and it's probably fair to say that that's happened. What's happened in Ukraine is unprecedented, and well, it's just massive. But yes, the climate crisis is equally important as well. I think the two are linked, really. If we can have an energy crisis in Europe because of Russian gas and a reliance on Russian gas, then we can definitely have a material crisis because of our reliance on Chinese steel. and everything is kind of linked together. Our reaction to climate change is linked to our reaction in the West to what's happening in the Ukraine, and so, you know, the solution is linked as well. And if we can become less reliant on fossil fuels, if we can be more self-sufficient in terms of how much steel we recycle in Scotland and the UK, then, you know, that makes it easier to create that fairer, juster world in the future, hopefully. So yes, the focus maybe isn't on climate change as much as it should be. You know, if you look at the coverage of things like the Indian heat wave as well, that's not getting nearly as much coverage as it should. But the solutions are linked too. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep on pressing on these points, I think.
Perhaps, Kim, time for just one final question. And I want to turn to, maybe I can take two together. Maybe I'll be sly and try and get a couple in at the same time. The first one says, you know, the Queen's speech mentioned the success of COP26, but how do we get big players like China, India, to come to the table to recognise the urgency of the issue, asks John. And then perhaps I could say alongside that, Anne asks, does Friends of the Earth have a list of recycling facilities or something like that for different materials? Because when she was looking for a facility to recycle bottle lids, the closest she could find is Southampton. For someone who's in Shetland, that is quite a challenge.
That's no good, is it? So I think for that, you should try the Zero Waste Scotland website. Yeah, I would start there because I know they do have a tool where you can input whatever material you're trying to recycle, and you can find out where the nearest facilities are. So try looking around on the Zero Waste Scotland website would be my tip for that. In terms of China and India and getting them to be more involved, I think if I knew the answer to that one, then I probably wouldn't be in this job. I'd be involved in the negotiations themselves. But yeah, it's got to happen. And I think maybe part of the solution is to recognize a bit more in the West our historic contribution to climate change. You know, we in this country, we've been, since the Industrial Revolution, pumping out greenhouse gases for hundreds of years now. So, you know, we chopped down our own forests a long time ago, and now we're saying to Brazil, you've got to protect the Amazon. We've got to take some more responsibility. And, you know, that means building back our own forests, but it also maybe means paying the global South to keep the resources that they have, and to make sure that people in those countries have a good quality of life, which means that they don't have to use their resources in the same way that we had to get to where we are today. You know, everybody around the world deserves a certain basic standard of living, and we shouldn't be denying people in the global South that just because it makes it a bit harder for us to reach our climate change targets. The goal should be for a fairer, just society. So yes, I think it maybe comes back to taking responsibility ourselves.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you, Kim. Thank you for sharing with us. I can see some incredible words of thanks, but just to share one with you from someone who had to leave us just a moment ago, who said that they found tonight incredibly informative, some great ideas to share, but the circular economy sounds like the way forward. Thank you very much for sharing with us. And I'm going to hand over now to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Callum, for the expert way in which you managed that increasingly lively chat for the question and answer session there. And thank you to Kim. I introduced Kim as a leading expert on the circular economy in Scotland, but we've also heard tonight that she is an inspiring, challenging and highly effective communicator on this issue. In the 9 months she's been doing the circular economy campaigner role for Friends of the Earth Scotland, you can already see and feel the impact that she's making with people all across the country. So thank you very much, Kim, for telling us about the problem of material consumption and why it matters, with that 82% staggering figure of our own footprint here in Scotland, and what should we be doing instead. And I think that cry to get involved in a campaign right now on the circular economy bill with Friends of the Earth Scotland. We know that SCIAF, Justice and Peace Scotland, ourselves and other partners in the Stop Climate Chaos Scotland coalition will be involved in that as well. So there's a really good opportunity for us to influence that. So thank you very much, Kim, for a fantastic presentation and really making us all better informed, but also up for that challenge of dealing with a problem that we, as Pope Francis would say, hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor in our answer in addressing overconsumption here in Scotland, the impact around the world. Kim, we would like to finish by saying a prayer for you. Loving God, we thank you for the insight and vision of Kim. We thank you for what she has shared with us tonight. We ask that you anoint her anew, such that her life and her work may continue to be empowered by your Spirit. Amen.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed the session. Thank you for listening and for all your questions as well. It was a really, really interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and
Thanks,
Kim,
Anne.
indeed. And now we're going to say a prayer for Echo Congregation Scotland. God of creation, we thank you for Echo Congregation Scotland. We pray that your Spirit will empower them in their prayer, worship, and conversation as they seek to discover what it means to care for God's creation and act to live justly in a transformed world. Amen.
Thank you.
And now, as we come to the formal end of the evening, we are going to pray for all those gathered here tonight, that we may be empowered by the Holy Spirit. And the prayer is a prayer which has been written by our friend Dermot O'Mercu.
Come, Holy Spirit, breathe down upon our troubled world. Shake the tired foundations of our crumbling institutions. Break the rules that keep you out of all our sacred spaces, and from the dust and rubble, gather up the seedlings of a new creation.
Come, Holy Spirit, inflame once more the dying embers of our weariness. Shake us of our complacency, whisper our names once more, and scatter your gifts of grace with wild abandon. Break open the prisons of our inner being, and let your raging justice be our sign of liberty.
Come, Holy Spirit, and lead us to places we would rather not go. Expand the horizons of our limited imaginations. Awaken in our souls dangerous dreams for a new tomorrow, and rekindle in our hearts the fire of prophetic enthusiasm.
Come, Holy Spirit, whose justice outwits international conspiracy, whose light outshines spiritual bigotry, whose peace can overcome the destructive potential of warfare, whose promise invigorates our every effort to create a new heaven and a new earth now and forever.
empowered by the Spirit, we continue the mission entrusted to us. Come, Holy Spirit, come. Now, next Thursday, we continue our Towards Pentecost series with Philippa Whitford, who is going to talk about a well-being recovery from COVID. So thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you to Stephen and Echo Congregation Scotland